wrestlers, the masked superhero wrestlers, who not only battled in the ring, but also battled evil. Now, Mexico, of course, has a tradition of masked heroes. Just like in the United States, though this tradition is of a much different nature. For more than 20 years, the most popular Latin American fighter of evil, Santo, blazed across the silver screen, attacking vampires, werewolves, mummies, and other nasty monsters. Santo was created and played by Rodolfo Guzman Huerta, who first achieved hero status as a wrestler in the ring and became well known across Mexico. As Santo, the wrestler, Huerta never appeared without his silver mask. Now, his first movie, Cerebro del Mal, The Evil Brain, was filmed in Cuba just before Castro's revolution in 1958. A second film, Cargamento Blanco, White Cargo, was shot at basically the same time. Now, sadly, these two films were shelved and not released. But in September 1960, a comic book-like weekly, Santo, El Enmascarado, Santo, El Enmascarado de Plata, Santo, the silver-masked one, begins publication. This comic book is a mega hit with the kiddies and furthers Santo's popularity and, well, basically promote the release of the two Cuban films. This happens early in 1961. Now, that very same year, Santo made 4 additional movies, beginning with Santo contra los Zombies, Santo versus the Zombies. In 1962, Santo appeared in the first of his several vampire films, the gothically lyrical Santo contra los mujeres vampiros, Santo versus the vampire women. This was directed by Alfonso Corona Blake. Santo contra las mujeres vampiros would be a big hit in Mexico and Latin America, prompting Florida-based producer K. Gordon Murray to dub the movie into English and release it as Samson versus the Vampire Women to drive-in cinemas across the United States. Santo would fight a variety of monsters and, mad scientists, but he was frequently bedeviled by vampires. For example, Santo contra el Baron Bracola, 1965, also known as Santo versus Baron Bracola. The vampire baron in this movie was modeled after the late, great Bela Lugosi, the Lord High Priest of the Living Dead. And stills of the legendary actor were actually used in the advertisements for the movie. By 1966, the Santo character had taken on a new quality, having transformed from a simple wrestler-fighter of evil into a super scientist. This super scientist actually invents a time machine. The first of Santo's Technicolor vampire films, Santo y el Tesoro de Dracula, also known as El Tesoro de Dracula, also known as Santo contra Dracula, also known as El Vampiro y el Sexo, also known as Santo and Dracula's Treasure, which was directed by Rene Cardona. This movie proceeds in 2 movements. As first, a scientist's daughter, Luisa, played by Nolia Knoll, uses a time machine and ends up being vampirized by Carlos Augusti in a role familiar from La Invasión de los Vampires. He played Count Dracula in that movie, and he plays Count Dracula again. Now, Santo, the superhero wrestler, Rodolfo Guzman Huerta, witnesses the events that are happening, the vampirization, on a TV monitor in his Batman-style secret laboratory. Santo follows her and locates the Count's treasure. And in spite of a mysterious masked villain's opposition, Santo manages to destroy both the vampire and his treasure, but is unable to save the unfortunate Noel. As usual for both the period and the subgenre, the movie is flavored with plenty of comic book violence. as well as lovely and barely clad women who are often involved in repeated freestyle wrestling bouts. A sexier version of this film, known as El Vampiro and El Sexo, which featured bare-breasted women, was prepared for the export American and European market. Santo's next outing, La Venganza de las Mujeres Vampiros, also known as Santo in La Venganza de las Mujeres Vampiros, also known as The Vengeance of the Vampire Women, 1969, and directed by Federico Curiel, tries to recapture the weirdly fascinating Gothic narrative delirium of Alfonso Corona Blake's Santo contra las Mujeres Vampiros. Now, in the movie, the vampire countess Myra, played by Gina Romand, is basically the superhero wrestler's arch enemy, due to the fact that Santo just happens to be the last descendant of the man who impaled her Transylvanian ancestors way back in 1630. She is revived by a mad scientist, Dr. Brancor Victor Junco, while the Countess recruits the Countess basically recruits a vampire army of both sexes. The Doctor concocts a monster, Frankenstein fashion, called Razos, played by Nathaniel Leon. Then Santos saves an attractive journalist, Pappy, played by Norma Lazareno, from a fate worse than death, the fate of vampire sex slave, and sex slave to the horny creature, and of course the lustful bisexual vampires. Santo takes the creature apart and terminates the mad scientist by blowing up his laboratory before burning and staking all the vampires. By this time, the Santo films had become far more adult in their iconography. There's a lot, and I mean a lot, of exquisite breasts and delightful derrieres featured on screen. Now, Santo's next opponents in the horror genre included a return engagement with Dracula, and in Santo y Blue Demon contra Dracula and El Hombre Lobo, 1970. Santo and Blue Demon versus Count Dracula and the Wolfman, as well as a battle with several monstrous creatures in Santo contra los Asesinos de Otros Mundos, 1971. Santo versus the Space Assassins. There's also two encounters with mummies, Santo contra las Momias, Santo versus the Mummy, and La Venganza de la Momia, The Vengeance of the Mummy, which are both 1971. And yet another battle with an evil and threatening female, Santo contra la hija de Frankenstein, 1972. Santo versus Frankenstein's daughter, in which the silver-masked wrestler superhero, having defeated a Frankenstein creature called Ursus, takes on the mad scientist's evil daughter, played by Gina Romand, who's a villainous female, who uses corpses and young women's blood to concoct a youth elixir in order to extend the life of the elixir. She tries to obtain the blood of an extraordinary man, Santo, played by Rodolfo Guzman Huerta, and to this end kidnaps him. As the experiment goes horribly wrong, Santo manages to, hang on to his powerful blood, while Frankenstein's daughter's aunt, Lucy Garado, is transformed into a withered living mummy. Santo then liberates all the kidnapped young women, who of course are ever so grateful. Santo's next adventure, saw him terminate in his customary brutal fashion a group of satanic lepers in Santo contra las Fuentes del Terror, 1972, also known as Santo versus the People of Terror. The silver-masked one then again became involved in his favorite world of mad scientists and crazy surgery in Santo contra el Evil Dr. Muerte, Santo versus the Evil Dr. Death, which is from 1973. By then, Huerta, who was born in 1915 and was pushing 60, and decided to hang up the silver mask, making one last inferior Santo film in 1983, the same year that Huerta passed away. In spite of their low production values and often hastily written scripts in which action was often improvised on the spot, Santo, Rodolfo Guzman Huerta, became a national star in Mexico, and his films were released to adoring audiences all over Latin America. Now, the silver-masked one, Santos, was not the only wrestler superhero blazing across the screens of Mexican and Latin American theaters in the mid-19